The torches guttered in the evening wind, casting dancing shadows across the cobblestones of Merchant Square. Mira clutched her children closer as the auctioneer's voice boomed across the crowd, his words cutting through her like rusty blades. Lot 47, one breeding Omega, past prime but still functional. Two whelps included, boy of 7 winters, girl of 5. Starting bid, 3 silver marks. The jeers began immediately. Nobles in their fine silks and furs pressed closer to the platform, their painted faces twisted with cruel amusement. Mira felt her cheeks burn as their eyes raked over her rounded form, her torn dress barely covering her generous curves. She had once been proud of her body, proud of the children it had borne and nurtured. Now it felt like armor made of shame. Look at the size of her! Lady Cordelia's shrill laugh pierced the air. What alpha would want such a cow? She'd crush him beneath her. Little Finn pressed his face against Mira's hip, his small body trembling. Beside him, Sarah whimpered, her thumbs stuck firmly in her mouth. Mira wanted to wrap them both in her arms and flee, but the iron shackles around her wrists made such comfort impossible. The chains clinked with each small movement, announcing her captivity to all who cared to listen. Do I hear 3 silver? The auctioneer's staff struck the wooden platform with a sharp crack. Come now, lords and ladies. Even if you don't want the Omega, the children will train up well enough. The boy's got strong shoulders for his age. A portly merchant near the front raised a lazy hand. 2 silver. And that's generous, considering the condition of the merchandise. More laughter rippled through the crowd. Mira closed her eyes, trying to block out their voices, trying to transport herself somewhere else, anywhere else. She thought of the small cottage where she had raised her children in peace, before the tax collectors came, before the debt notices, before the magistrate declared her property forfeit and herself bound to servitude. 2 silver it is. Going once. I'll take them. The voice cut through the evening air like a blade through silk. It was not loud, but it carried an authority that made every other sound fade to nothing. The crowd turned as one, their laughter dying on their lips. Even with her eyes closed, Mira felt the change in the atmosphere. The jeering nobles had fallen silent. The very air seemed to thicken with an electric tension that made her skin prickle. Slowly she opened her eyes. He stood at the edge of the square, mounted on a destrier so black it seemed to absorb the torchlight. His armor was the color of midnight, polished to a mirror shine, and his dark hair fell to his shoulders in waves. But it was his eyes that made Mira's breath catch, pale gray, like winter ice, and fixed directly on her. The Alpha King. She had never seen him before, but there was no mistaking him. Power radiated from him like heat from a forge, and when he dismounted with fluid grace, the crowd parted before him like water before a ship's prow. His boots rang against the cobblestones as he approached the platform, each step measured and deliberate. Your Majesty, the auctioneer stammered, dropping to one knee so quickly he nearly toppled from the platform. We were not expecting. How much? The king's voice was quiet, conversational. He might have been asking about the weather. Your Majesty, the current bid is 2 silver marks. I'll give you 50 gold. The king's gaze never left Mira's face. For all 3, a collective gasp rose from the crowd. 50 gold marks was enough to buy a small manor, complete with lands and livestock. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. The merchant who had bid 2 silver was sputtering, his face turning purple. Your Majesty, surely there's been some mistake. The king turned those ice-gray eyes on him, and the merchant's words died in his throat. Are you questioning my judgment, Lord Blackwood? No, Your Majesty, of course not. Then I suggest you return to your counting house. The king's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. The auction is concluded. With trembling hands, the auctioneer produced a key and unlocked Mira's shackles. The iron fell away with a dull clank, leaving red welts around her wrists. She rubbed them absently, still staring at the king in disbelief. Come, he said simply, extending a gauntleted hand toward her. It's cold. Mira hesitated. This had to be some cruel jest, some elaborate humiliation designed to break her spirit completely. Kings did not rescue Omega servants from auction blocks. Kings did not pay 50 times the asking price for slaves they had never seen before. But Finn and Sarah were looking up at her with desperate hope in their eyes, and the alternative was to belong to Lord Blackwood or someone equally vile. Slowly she reached out and took the king's hand. His gauntlet was surprisingly warm. He helped her down from the platform with the same courtesy he might have shown a duchess, then knelt to address her children directly. "I am King Aldrich," he said, his voice gentler now. "You need not fear me. No one will hurt you again." Sarah removed her thumb from her mouth long enough to whisper, "Promise?" "I promise." The king rose and gestured to his guards, a dozen men in matching black armor who had materialized from the crowd. "Captain Marcus, see that they are escorted safely to the castle. Have chambers prepared in the eastern wing. Send for the healers and have hot food sent up immediately." "Yes, your majesty." The captain's voice held no surprise, as though his king made a habit of rescuing strangers from slave auctions. As the guards formed a protective circle around them, Mira heard the whispers begin. The nobles who had been jeering moments before now watched in stunned silence as the king's own guard escorted their former entertainment toward the castle gates. "Why?" Mira found herself asking as they walked through the twisting streets. The king strode beside her, his presence both comforting and intimidating. "Why would you? I don't understand." "Because you are worth more than 2 silver marks," he replied without looking at her. "All of you." The castle loomed before them, its towers piercing the darkening sky like spears. Guards snapped to attention as they approached the massive gates, which swung open with barely a whisper. Inside, torches lined the walls, casting warm light over tapestries and carved stone. It was beautiful, but Mira felt like an intruder in her torn dress and bare feet. "I don't belong here," she whispered. This time the king did look at her, those pale eyes studying her face. Belonging is not determined by birth or circumstance. It is earned through character and deed. You protected your children when others would have abandoned them. You endured humiliation with dignity when others would have broken. You belong wherever you choose to make your stand. They climbed a wide staircase, their footsteps echoing in the vaulted corridors. Servants appeared and disappeared like ghosts, lighting their way and opening doors with silent efficiency. Finally, they stopped before a set of carved oak doors. "These chambers are yours," the king said. "The children's room adjoins. Food will arrive shortly, and the healers will tend to any injuries. Tomorrow we will discuss your future." Mira stared at him. "My future? You are free now. What you do with that freedom is your choice." He paused, his hand on the door handle. "But if you choose to stay, there will be work for you here. Honest work, with fair wages." The doors opened to reveal chambers more luxurious than any Mira had ever imagined. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm light over cushioned chairs and a bed large enough for 3 people. Through an open doorway, she could see a smaller room with 2 small beds, already made up with soft blankets. Finn and Sarah ran inside with delighted squeals, bouncing on the beds and peering out the windows at the courtyard below. For the first time in months, they looked like children again, instead of frightened animals. "Thank you," Mira whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know why you did this, but thank you." The king inclined his head gravely. "Rest now. Tomorrow brings new challenges." He turned to go, but Mira called after him. "Your Majesty? What kind of work?" "We'll discuss it tomorrow," he repeated, but something in his expression had changed, become more guarded. "For now, just rest." After he left, Mira explored the chambers in wonder. There was a wash basin with clean water, soft towels, even fresh clothing laid out on the bed. The children's room contained not only beds but toys, wooden horses and dolls that must have cost more than Mira's family had earned in a year. A knock at the door announced the arrival of food. Not the gruel and stale bread they had subsisted on for weeks, but roasted chicken, fresh bread, fruits, and cream cakes that made Sarah's eyes go wide with delight. They ate in comfortable silence, the children finally relaxing as their bellies filled. But even as she watched them laugh and play, Mira could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. Not with the king's kindness, that seemed genuine enough, but there had been something in his expression when she asked about work, a guardedness that spoke of hidden complexities. Later, after the children had fallen asleep in their soft beds, Mira sat by the fire and examined the bundle of papers that had been her only possession at the auction. Most were worthless: old receipts, a letter from her mother, a sketch Finn had made of their old cottage. But at the bottom of the bundle, she found something that made her blood run cold. It was an official writ, stamped with what appeared to be the royal seal. The paper was expensive, the writing precise, but something about it felt wrong. The edges were too clean, the ink too fresh, and the content? According to the document, she and her children were not free citizens fallen on hard times. They were escaped slaves, property of the crown, fugitives from royal justice. The writ authorized their capture and return to royal service. But that was impossible. Mira's family had never owned slaves, never served in the royal household. Her father had been a blacksmith, her mother a seamstress. Free people, if poor ones. Unless someone had wanted them to disappear, unless someone had forged documents to justify their enslavement. Her hands trembling, Mira examined the seal more closely. In the firelight, she could see the slight irregularities, the way the wax had been pressed just a fraction too hard. It was a good forgery, good enough to fool a magistrate or an auctioneer, but not good enough to fool someone who knew what to look for. Someone had wanted her family destroyed. Someone with access to royal seals and official paper. Someone inside the court itself. As if summoned by her thoughts, she heard voices in the corridor outside. Not the king's voice, but others. Nobles by the sound of their refined accents. 50 gold marks, one was saying. For that, and her brats, the king's lost his mind. Or found new appetites, another replied with a snicker. Perhaps he likes them, soft and grateful. Careful, a third voice warned. The walls have ears, and the king has never been known for mercy toward those who speak against him. The voices faded as they moved down the corridor, but their words echoed in Mira's mind. She was not naive. She understood what they were implying, understood the assumptions they were making. The fat Omega and her children, rescued by the king. It would be easy enough to believe she had traded her body for their freedom, but that was not what troubled her most. What troubled her was the casual way they had dismissed the king's judgment, the certainty in their voices that his actions were foolish or base. These were not loyal subjects concerned for their ruler's reputation. These were vultures, circling and waiting for weakness. And if someone in the court had orchestrated her family's downfall, if someone had access to royal seals and the authority to forge official documents. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She quickly hid the forged writ beneath the other papers and called out, "Enter." It was not a servant who stepped through the door, but the king himself. He had removed his armor and wore simple dark clothing that somehow made him seem more intimidating, not less. Those pale eyes swept the room, taking in the remains of their meal, the children's toys scattered about. Mira's position by the fire. "Are the chambers satisfactory?" he asked. "More than satisfactory, Your Majesty. They're wonderful." Mira struggled to her feet, suddenly conscious of her appearance. Even with the clean dress, she felt enormous and ungainly in his presence. "Good, I wanted to check on the children." He moved toward the adjoining room with surprising quietness for such a large man. Mira followed, watching as he stood in the doorway, observing Finn and Sarah as they slept. His expression was unreadable, but something in his stillness spoke of deep thought. "They sleep peacefully," he observed. "For the first time in weeks," Mira whispered. "Thank you." He turned back to her, studying her face in the dim light. "You have questions." It was not a question, but a statement. Mira hesitated, then nodded. "Why did you really buy us, Your Majesty? And please don't tell me it was simple kindness. Kings don't pay 50 gold marks for kindness." A slight smile touched his lips, the first she had seen. "You're more perceptive than they think." "They?" "The nobles who believe you're a simple peasant, good for nothing but labor and breeding." His voice carried a note of distaste. "They see only what they wish to see." Mira felt heat rise in her cheeks. "And what do you see?" "I see a woman who endured public humiliation without breaking, who protected her children when she had nothing left to give, who asks intelligent questions when others would simply accept good fortune." He paused. "I also see someone who has been betrayed. The words hit her like a physical blow. What do you mean? Instead of answering directly, the king moved to the window, gazing out at the moonlit courtyard. Tell me about your husband. The change of subject was so abrupt that Mira nearly stumbled. My husband? The children's father. What happened to him? Mira wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the fire. He died of fever 3 years ago. We managed for a while, but without his income... She trailed off, unwilling to relive those desperate months. And the debts? The magistrate's decision to sell you into servitude? The tax collectors came, said we owed more than the cottage was worth. When I couldn't pay, they took everything. The words came out flat, emotionless. She had told this story so many times it had lost all meaning. Convenient, the king murmured. Your Majesty? He turned back to her, and she saw something dangerous in those pale eyes. 3 years is a long time to accumulate debts, but tax collectors are usually more flexible with widows and orphans. There are provisions in the law, unless someone specifically instructed them otherwise. Mira's heart began to pound. You think someone wanted us destroyed? I think, the king said carefully, that there are people in this kingdom who profit from human misery. People who see opportunity where others see tragedy. His gaze fixed on the bundle of papers beside her chair. May I? With trembling hands, Mira retrieved the forged writ and handed it to him. She watched his face as he examined it, saw the moment when his expression hardened into something that made her blood run cold. Where did you get this? It was with my things when they took us. She swallowed hard. I didn't understand it at first, but now, someone forged that, didn't they? The king held the document up to the firelight, examining the seal with the trained eye of someone who had seen thousands of similar documents. This is very good work, expensive work, the kind that requires access to royal supplies and considerable skill. Which means we have a problem. The king's voice was deadly quiet. Someone in my own court has been forging royal documents. Someone who wanted your family to disappear quietly, without questions or investigations. The room seemed to spin around Mira. She groped for a chair, suddenly dizzy. But why? We're nobody. We have nothing worth stealing. Perhaps you have something you don't realize. Information, connections, bloodline. He trailed off, his eyes sharp with speculation. Tell me about your husband's work. He was a blacksmith, as I said. Nothing special. What kind of work? Horseshoes and kitchen knives, or something more specialized? Mira frowned, trying to understand why it mattered. He did some work for the castle, weapons, armor repair, but that was years ago, before the children were born. Which weapons? Which repairs? I don't know. He didn't discuss his work much. But even as she said it, fragments of memory began to surface. Thomas coming home late, his clothes smelling of strange oils, whispered conversations with men she didn't recognize, a chest in their bedroom that was always locked, always hidden. The king seemed to read her thoughts. There was something else, wasn't there? Maybe. He had a chest, kept it locked. After he died, I couldn't find the key. The tax collectors took it with everything else. Describe it. Iron-bound oak, about this big. She gestured with her hands. Heavy. There were markings on the lock, symbols I didn't recognize. The king went very still. What kind of symbols? Like flowers, but not quite, and a crown, but twisted somehow. Mira struggled to remember details that had seemed unimportant at the time. Thomas said it was just old work, nothing valuable. Your husband lied to you. The blunt statement hit her like a slap. What do you mean? Those symbols mark it as a royal armory chest. They're used to store sensitive materials, plans, codes, sometimes weapons or documents that could compromise the kingdom's security. The king's expression was grim. If your husband had access to such things, you think someone killed him for it? I think someone wanted to make sure whatever he knew died with him. And when they realized you might have inherited his knowledge or his materials, they arranged for your family's destruction. The room was spinning again. Mira pressed her hands to her temples, trying to process what she was hearing. This is insane. Thomas was a simple blacksmith. He made horseshoes and kitchen knives. Simple blacksmiths don't have royal armory chests, the king said quietly. Your husband was working for someone, Mira. Someone who trusted him with secrets worth killing for. A soft whimper from the children's room made them both freeze. Sarah was crying in her sleep, small distressed sounds that cut through Mira like knives. Without thinking, she rose and went to comfort her daughter, stroking the child's hair until the whimpering stopped. When she returned to the main chamber, she found the king studying the forged document again, his expression thoughtful. What happens now? She whispered. Now we find out who did this, and we make them pay. The words were spoken softly, but they carried the weight of absolute certainty. And my children will be protected. I give you my word. Mira wanted to believe him, but trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. Forgive me, Your Majesty, but promises are easily made. Indeed they are. The king folded the forged document and tucked it inside his jacket, which is why I'll demonstrate my commitment rather than simply declaring it. Before she could ask what he meant, he moved to the door and spoke quietly to someone in the corridor. Moments later, Captain Marcus appeared, his armor gleaming in the firelight. Your Majesty, double the guard on these chambers. No one enters without my direct permission, and I want a full investigation into the origins of this document. He handed over a different paper. Mira hadn't seen him take it from her bundle. Start with the paper mills and seal makers. Someone supplied the materials. At once, Your Majesty. After the captain left, the king turned back to Mira. You and your children are under my personal protection now. But I need you to understand, this isn't over. Whoever orchestrated your downfall will not simply accept defeat. They'll try again. Then why not just let us go? Send us away where they can't find us? Because running solves nothing. Because innocent people deserve justice. And because, he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, because I have reason to believe this conspiracy extends far beyond your family's tragedy. The weight of his words settled over her like a heavy cloak. You think there are others? I know there are others. Families destroyed, people disappeared, wealth transferred to unknown hands. The forged documents, the corrupt magistrates, the convenient deaths, it's all connected. Mira sank back into her chair, overwhelmed. And you think my husband's death was part of it? I think your husband stumbled onto something he shouldn't have seen, or someone decided he knew too much about the wrong things. The king moved to the window again, his silhouette dark against the moonlight. The question is whether he left any evidence behind. The chest. The chest. He turned back to her. Did the tax collectors take it to the public auction? Or somewhere else? I don't know. I assumed everything went to auction, but she tried to remember the chaos of that horrible day when strangers had invaded her home and stripped it bare. There were some men I didn't recognize. They took certain things separately. What kind of things? The chest, some of Thomas's tools, papers from his workshop. The memories were coming clearer now. They said those items had been pre-sold to cover special debts. Special debts. The king's voice was flat. Convenient again. You think they have it, this conspiracy? I think they took everything that might implicate them and destroyed the rest. He was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Unless your husband was cleverer than they realize. What do you mean? Instead of answering, the king asked, did he have any friends among the other smiths? Anyone he trusted? Old Henrik, maybe. They worked together sometimes. Mira felt a spark of hope. If Thomas hid anything, Henrik might know about it. Henrik the smith in Millbrook? You know him? I know everyone who's ever done work for the castle. The king's smile was thin, and Henrik is one of the few men I'd trust with my life. He moved toward the door, then paused. Get some sleep. Tomorrow will bring answers, but tonight you're safe. Your Majesty? Mira called after him. Why are you doing this? Really? The king studied her for a long moment, and she saw something unexpected in those ice-gray eyes. Sadness, perhaps, or regret. Because once I failed to protect someone who deserved better. I won't make that mistake again. After he left, Mira sat by the dying fire, trying to process everything she had learned. Her husband, a simple blacksmith, had apparently been involved in something dangerous enough to get him killed. Her family's destruction had been orchestrated by people with access to royal resources. And now she and her children were caught in the middle of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the kingdom. But even as fear clawed at her heart, she felt something else stirring. Anger. Not the helpless rage she had felt at the auction, but something colder and more focused. These people, whoever they were, had destroyed her life, terrorized her children, and murdered her husband. They had expected her to disappear quietly, to be broken by their machinations. They were about to learn how wrong they were. As she finally prepared for bed, Mira found herself thinking about the king's last words. Someone he had failed to protect. The sadness in his eyes suggested it had been someone important to him. Someone whose loss still haunted him. Well, she was not that person. She was Mira Ironhand, widow of Thomas the Smith, mother of Finn and Sarah. She had endured poverty, humiliation, and despair. She had protected her children when she had nothing left to give. And now, with the king's protection and the promise of justice, she would find out who had destroyed her family. They would pay for what they had done. The fire crackled lower as sleep finally claimed her. But even in dreams, she could not escape the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The auction had been meant to destroy her, to erase her family from the world without trace or memory. Instead, it had awakened something dangerous. In the morning, she would begin to discover just how dangerous. But first, she would need to survive the night, because in the corridors outside her chambers, other conversations were taking place. Whispered discussions between figures in expensive robes, their faces hidden in shadow. The forged document had been discovered. The king was asking questions, and some secrets were worth killing to protect. As Mira slept, unaware of the danger gathering around her, a figure in a hooded cloak slipped through the castle's hidden passages. In their hand was another document, this one bearing a genuine royal seal, a death warrant, signed and ready. The only question was whether they would have the courage to use it. Dawn came too soon, filtering through the tall windows of Mira's chamber like pale honey. She woke to the sound of her children's laughter, a sound she had almost forgotten. Through the adjoining doorway, she could see Finn and Sarah playing with the wooden toys, their faces bright with joy for the first time in months. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Enter," she called, quickly smoothing her hair. A servant girl no older than 16 appeared, carrying a tray laden with fresh bread, eggs, and what looked like real butter. "Good morning, my lady. His Majesty requests your presence in the solar after you've broken your fast." My lady. The words felt strange on Mira's ears. Yesterday she had been merchandise on an auction block. Today she was being addressed with respect by castle servants. "Thank you," Mira said. "The children are to remain in the nursery wing, my lady. There are guards posted, and the castle's governess will see to their needs." The girl's smile was warm and genuine. "They'll be safe there." After eating and dressing in the simple but well-made gown that had been provided, Mira made her way through the castle's corridors. The architecture was old but well-maintained, with tapestries depicting battles and hunts adorning the walls. Servants bowed respectfully as she passed, their expressions curious but not unkind. The solar turned out to be a circular chamber at the top of one of the castle's towers, its walls lined with books and scrolls. Morning light streamed through tall windows, illuminating a figure seated behind an oak desk covered in papers. King Aldrich looked up as she entered, his pale gray eyes assessing. He had traded his dark clothing for practical leather and wool, but somehow still managed to radiate authority. "You slept well?" he asked without preamble. "Well enough, Your Majesty." Mira remained standing near the door, uncertain of the protocol. "Sit." He gestured to a chair across from his desk. "We have much to discuss." As she settled into the chair, Mira noticed that the forged document from her bundle lay open on the desk, surrounded by other papers covered in neat handwriting. "Captain Marcus has made some interesting discoveries," the king continued. "The paper used in this forgery comes from only one mill in the kingdom, Crowley's near the eastern border. They keep meticulous records of their sales." Mira leaned forward. "And?" 3 months ago, someone purchased a significant quantity of their finest parchment, someone using the name Lord Ashworth. The king's expression was grim. The problem is, Lord Ashworth died 2 years ago in a hunting accident. His estate was sold to pay debts. So whoever bought the paper was using a false name. Precisely, but they paid in gold, and Crowley remembered the transaction because the buyer was very specific about the paper's quality. They wanted something that would pass royal inspection. Mira felt a chill. They were planning this for months. At least, which suggests this wasn't a crime of opportunity, but a calculated campaign. The king lifted another document from the pile. I've had my clerks review the records of similar cases, families destroyed by sudden death, people vanishing into slavery with questionable paperwork. How many? 17 families in the past 2 years, all of them headed by craftsmen, minor merchants, or skilled laborers. All of them with some connection, however tenuous, to royal projects or castle work. The scope of it took Mira's breath away. 17 families? 43 people total, men, women, children, all disappeared into the slave trade with forged documents. The king's voice was deadly quiet. Your family makes 18. Mira sank back in her chair, overwhelmed. But why? What could they possibly gain? Information, access, the elimination of potential witnesses. The king stood and moved to one of the windows, gazing out at the courtyard below. Your husband wasn't the only one with knowledge that could prove dangerous. Henrik the Smith mentioned others, men who worked on sensitive projects and then died under mysterious circumstances. You spoke with Henrik? I sent riders at dawn. They should return with him by midday. The king turned back to her. Assuming he's still alive, the implication hit her like a physical blow. You think they might try to silence him too? I think anyone connected to this conspiracy is in danger until we root it out completely. His eyes fixed on hers, including you and your children. As if summoned on his words, the sound of running footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Captain Marcus burst through the door without ceremony, his face grim. Your Majesty, we have a problem. The king was instantly alert. What kind of problem? The riders sent to fetch Henrik. They found his forge burned to the ground. No sign of the old man. Mira's heart sank. Is he dead? We don't know, Marcus replied. There was no body in the ruins, but there were signs of a struggle, and... He hesitated, glancing between the king and Mira. Speak freely, the king commanded. There were hoof prints leading away from the forge, at least 6 riders heading toward the Thornwood. If they took him alive, they'll try to extract information before they kill him, the king finished. His expression was like carved stone. How long ago? The fire was still smoldering when we arrived. Perhaps 6 hours, no more. The king moved to a cabinet and withdrew a sword belt, buckling it around his waist with practiced efficiency. Assemble a hunting party. 20 men, fast horses. We leave within the hour. Your Majesty, Marcus said carefully, if this is a trap, then we spring it on our terms. The king's smile was sharp as a blade. But Henrik is the key to unraveling this conspiracy. We cannot afford to lose him. Mira stood abruptly. I'm coming with you. Both men turned to stare at her. The king's expression was incredulous. Absolutely not. Henrik was my husband's friend. If he's in danger because of something Thomas knew, then this is my responsibility too. Your responsibility is to stay alive and protect your children, the king said firmly. I won't risk. Risk what? Losing your investment? The words came out sharper than Mira intended, but she was tired of being treated like helpless merchandise. I'm not asking for your permission, Your Majesty. I'm telling you that I'm going. The king's eyes narrowed dangerously. You seem to have forgotten that you are under my protection, which means you follow my orders. I seem to have forgotten that I'm free, Mira shot back. You said so yourself yesterday. Free people make their own choices. For a moment, the tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Captain Marcus looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the kingdom. Then, unexpectedly, the king laughed, a short, sharp sound. You have spine, I'll grant you that. His expression sobered. But this isn't a game, Mira. The people who destroyed your family won't hesitate to kill you if given the chance. Then don't give them the chance. Mira crossed her arms. I know Henrik. He trusts me. If he's injured or frightened, he might not cooperate with strangers. The king studied her for a long moment, his pale eyes unreadable. Finally, he sighed. Can you ride? I grew up on a farm, Your Majesty. I can ride. Very well, but you follow orders without question. You stay behind the guard at all times, and if I tell you to run, you run. Understood? Mira nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. Understood. An hour later, she found herself mounted on a gentle mare, surrounded by the king's guard as they rode through the castle gates. She had said goodbye to her children with promises to return soon, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. The Thornwood was a dark tangle of ancient trees and thorny undergrowths that marked the kingdom's eastern border. It was said to be haunted, though Mira suspected the only spirits lurking there were the very humankind with ill intentions. They rode hard for 2 hours before the king called a halt. Ahead, smoke still rose from the ruins of Henrik's forge, a black smudge against the autumn sky. Marcus, take half the men and circle around to the north, the king commanded. If anyone's watching the road, I want them to think we're a smaller force than we are. And if it's a trap, the captain asked, then we make them regret springing it. The king's smile was cold. Signal if you find anything. As Marcus and 10 soldiers disappeared into the trees, the king turned to Mira. Still sure about this? More sure than I've been about anything in years, she replied, surprising herself with the truth of it. They approached the forge cautiously, weapons drawn. The building had been thoroughly destroyed, not by accident, but with deliberate malice. Tools had been scattered and broken, the bellows slashed, even the anvil cracked with what must have been tremendous force. They were looking for something, the king observed, kneeling beside the ruins. Mira dismounted and picked her way through the debris, her heart aching at the destruction. This had been Henrik's life's work, 40 years of craftsmanship reduced to ash and twisted metal. Here, she called out, bending over something near what had been the back wall. Blood! The king joined her, examining the dark stains on the stones. Not much. Either he wasn't badly hurt or they were careful not to damage him permanently, Mira finished. Not until they get what they want. A whistle from the trees made them both look up. One of the guards was pointing toward a barely visible path that led deeper into the Thornwood. Trail leads that way, the soldier reported. 6 horses, maybe 7. Moving fast but not trying to hide their tracks. The king frowned. Either they're overconfident or they want us to follow, Mira said, the realization hitting her like a cold wave. This is a trap. Most likely. The king remounted his horse, which is why we're going to be very careful about how we spring it. They followed the trail deeper into the forest, moving slowly and staying alert for ambush. The trees grew thicker and the shadows deeper until they were riding through a twilight world of green gloom and rustling leaves. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, they heard voices ahead. The king raised his hand, and the entire party came to a silent halt. Through the trees, Mira could see a clearing where several figures stood around what appeared to be an old woodsman's hut. Their horses were tethered nearby, and even at this distance, she could see they were well armed and alert. Count them, the king whispered to one of his men. 8, Your Majesty. Maybe 9, hard to tell with the trees. The king nodded grimly. With Marcus and his men approaching from the north, they would still be outnumbered, but not hopelessly so. A cry of pain echoed from the hut, making Mira's blood run cold. Henrik's voice, unmistakable even in agony. We have to move now, she whispered urgently. Not yet, the king replied, his voice like steel. Patience wins battles, not passion. But even as he spoke, another cry rang out, weaker this time. Henrik was an old man. How much could he endure? There, one of the guards breathed, pointing to the north edge of the clearing. Captain Marcus and his men were visible now, moving like shadows between the trees. The king drew his sword, the blade singing as it cleared the scabbard. On my signal, he murmured, take them alive if possible. We need answers. The signal, when it came, was Marcus's war cry echoing across the clearing. The king's guard responded immediately, bursting from concealment with weapons raised and battle on their lips. The fight was brief but vicious. The kidnappers had been expecting pursuit, but not from two directions at once. Three fell in the first moments, cut down before they could fully draw their weapons. The others fought desperately but were quickly overwhelmed. When the clash of steel finally ended, two of the attackers lay dead and four were bound with their own rope. The king stood over them, his blade at the throat of what appeared to be their leader. "Start talking," he said conversationally. "Who hired you?" The man, scarred and grizzled with the look of a professional killer, spat in the dirt. "Go to hell. Eventually, perhaps, but you'll get there first if you don't cooperate." The king's voice remained calm, almost friendly. "My patience for torturers is somewhat limited." Mira pushed past the guards and into the hut, her heart hammering with fear. Henrik sat tied to a chair, his face bloody but his eyes alert. He looked up as she entered, confusion flickering across his weathered features. "Mira? Girl, what are you doing here?" "Rescuing you, apparently." She quickly cut his bonds with a dagger borrowed from one of the guards. "Are you badly hurt?" "Nothing that won't mend." Henrik rubbed his wrists where the ropes had bitten deep. "But child, you shouldn't have come. These men, they're not common bandits." "I know." Mira helped him to his feet, noting the careful way he moved. "They were asking about Thomas, weren't they?" Henrik's eyes sharpened. "How did you—" "Never mind. Yes, they wanted to know about your husband's work, specifically about a chest he kept." "The iron-bound one with the strange lock?" "Aye, that's the one." Henrik glanced toward the door, where the sounds of interrogation could be heard. "They seemed to think I knew where it was hidden." "Don't you?" "I know where Thomas said he hid it, but whether it's still there—" Henrik shrugged, then winced as the movement pulled at his injuries. "Your husband was a careful man, Mira. Careful and clever. If he suspected danger, he might have moved it." The king appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. "They're professionals, but not very loyal ones. A little persuasion, and they started talking." "And?" Mira asked. "They were hired through intermediaries, paid in gold to take Henrik alive and extract information about certain items connected to your husband's work." The king's eyes fixed on Henrik. What kind of work was Thomas really doing? Henrik looked uncomfortable. "Perhaps this isn't the place." "Henrik," the king's voice carried absolute authority. 17 families have been destroyed. 43 people sold into slavery. If you know something that could help us stop this, you have an obligation to speak." The old smith sighed heavily. Thomas was working on special commissions. Weapons, mostly, but not ordinary ones. Blades for specific purposes, armor with modifications. What kind of modifications? Secret compartments, hidden catches, ways to conceal documents or small objects. Henrik met the king's gaze directly. "He was making spy tools, Your Majesty, for people who needed to hide things from other people." The implications hit Mira like a thunderbolt. He was working for spies? Not directly, but his work. It was the kind that attracts attention from those who deal in secrets. Henrik's expression was troubled. Thomas knew it was dangerous. That's why he was so careful about the chest. The king stepped closer. "What was in the chest?" "Copies," Henrik said simply. Thomas made copies of everything. Designs, specifications, even correspondence from his clients. He called it insurance. Insurance against what? Against being silenced. Henrik's voice was barely above a whisper. He knew that men who deal in secrets sometimes decide their craftsmen know too much. The king was very still. "Where is this chest now?" "Hidden," Henrik replied. "Thomas showed me the place once, made me promise to tell his family if anything happened to him." His eyes found Mira's. "I was supposed to take you there after the funeral, but then the tax collectors came so quickly." "Where?" Mira asked urgently. Henrik hesitated, glancing around at the soldiers who had gathered to listen. "Perhaps we should discuss this somewhere more private." The king nodded. "Back to the castle. We'll continue this conversation in secure surroundings." But as they prepared to leave, Captain Marcus approached with troubling news. "Your Majesty, we found something else, hidden in the trees about a quarter-mile north." He handed the king a leather satchel, water-stained and muddy. Inside were more documents, official-looking papers with royal seals. More forgeries? Mira asked. The king examined them carefully, his expression growing darker with each page. No, these are genuine. Transfer orders for prisoners, shipping manifests, even payment authorizations. He looked up, his pale eyes cold with fury. These documents show exactly where the missing families were sent. Where? Henrik asked. The eastern provinces, sold to plantation owners and mine operators who don't ask questions about paperwork. The king's voice was deadly quiet. 43 people scattered across half the kingdom and treated as property. Mira felt sick. Those families, torn apart, their children sold like livestock, their lives destroyed for someone's profit. Can we find them? Can we bring them home? We can try, but first we need to identify who's behind this. The king tucked the documents inside his coat, which means we need to see what Thomas left in that chest. The ride back to the castle was somber, each person lost in their own thoughts. Mira found herself thinking about the families, wondering if any of them had children Sarah's age, if any of the mothers were as terrified as she had been on the auction block. They were almost to the castle gates when Henrik suddenly stiffened in his saddle. What is it? Mira asked. The old smith was staring at something ahead of them. Following his gaze, Mira saw a figure in expensive robes standing near the gates, surrounded by several well-dressed companions. Lord Pemberton, Henrik whispered, his face pale. One of Thomas's clients. The king's hand moved immediately to his sword hilt. Interesting timing. As they rode closer, Lord Pemberton stepped forward with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Your Majesty, thank goodness you've returned safely. When we heard about the trouble in the Thornwood, how did you hear about trouble in the Thornwood? The king asked mildly. Pemberton's smile faltered slightly. News travels fast, Your Majesty. Servants gossip. You know how it is. Indeed. The king dismounted, his movements casual but alert. Lord Pemberton, I don't believe you have met my guests. This is Mira Ironhand and Henrik the Smith. Pemberton's eyes flicked to Henrik and quickly away, but not before Mira caught a flash of something. Recognition? Fear? Charmed, Pemberton murmured, though I'm surprised to see the good Smith here. I heard his forge had suffered an unfortunate accident. You seem remarkably well informed about recent events, the king observed. Perhaps you'd join us for dinner. I'm sure you have many interesting stories to share. It was phrased as an invitation, but everyone present understood it as a command. Pemberton's smile became even more strained. Of course, Your Majesty, I would be honored. As they passed through the gates, Henrik leaned close to Mira. That man commissioned some of Thomas's most sensitive work, he whispered, and he paid very well for Thomas to keep quiet about it. Mira's blood ran cold. Do you think he's part of this? I think, Henrik replied grimly, that we're about to find out. But even as they entered the safety of the castle walls, Mira couldn't shake the feeling that the real danger was just beginning. Lord Pemberton and his companions might be inside the gates now, but that also meant they were inside the castle, inside where her children were sleeping. The thought sent ice through her veins. As soon as they reached the courtyard, she turned to the king. My children are safe, he assured her. I doubled the guard before we left, remember? But as if summoned by her fears, a young servant came running across the courtyard, his face panic-stricken. Your Majesty, he gasped. Come quickly! Something's happened in the eastern wing. The world seemed to tilt around Mira as she ran, following the king through corridors that suddenly seemed endless. Behind them, she could hear Lord Pemberton's smooth voice asking concerned questions, but all she cared about was reaching her children. The guards outside her chambers were still at their posts, but their faces were grim. Captain Marcus was already there, speaking in low, urgent tones to the king. What happened? Mira demanded. Marcus looked uncomfortable. The children are safe, he said quickly, but someone tried to get into their room through the window. The window? The chambers were on the second floor. Rope and grappling hook, the king said tersely. Professional work, but the shutters held, and the guards responded quickly. Did you catch anyone? The rope was cut from outside. Whoever it was escaped in the darkness. The king's expression was murderous, but they left something behind. He handed her a small piece of parchment, folded and sealed. With trembling fingers, Mira opened it. The message inside was brief and to the point. The children for the chest. You have until tomorrow at sunset. Come alone to the old mill, or they will suffer. Mira's legs gave out. She would have fallen if Henrik hadn't caught her arm. How? She whispered. How did they know about the chest? The king's pale eyes fixed on Lord Pemberton, who had just arrived with his companions. The nobleman's face was a picture of concerned confusion. What a terrible thing, Pemberton said, reading the note over the king's shoulder. Though I confess I don't understand the reference to a chest. Don't you? The king asked softly. For just a moment, Pemberton's mask slipped. The concerned nobleman disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating. Then the mask snapped back into place. I'm afraid I don't follow, Your Majesty. Then perhaps, the king said, drawing his sword in one smooth motion, you'd care to explain why my guards found rope fibers matching those from tonight's attempt in your saddlebags. The silence that followed was deafening. Pemberton's companions were reaching for their weapons when the king's guards surrounded them, steel singing as dozens of blades cleared their sheaths. I wouldn't, the king advised calmly. Pemberton straightened, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost all pretense of civility. You have no idea what you're interfering with, Boy King. This is bigger than your little kingdom, bigger than your naive notions of justice. Then enlighten me. The chest contains information that could destabilize 3 kingdoms and destroy half the noble houses in the realm. Pemberton's eyes glittered with malice. Trade agreements, spy networks, assassination contracts. Your precious blacksmith documented everything. Which is exactly why it needs to see daylight, the king replied. Guards, arrest Lord Pemberton and his men on charges of conspiracy, kidnapping, and treason. But as the guards moved forward, Pemberton smiled, a cold, triumphant expression that sent chills through Mira's soul. You think this ends with me? There are others, boy. Others with more power and fewer scruples. His gaze fixed on Mira. The woman and her whelps are marked. Even if you execute me tonight, they'll never be safe. We'll see about that, the king said grimly. But as Pemberton was dragged away, still laughing, Mira realized that their troubles were far from over. Someone had tried to take her children tonight. Someone would try again. And somewhere in the kingdom, a chest full of dangerous secrets was waiting to be found. The question was, would they find it before their enemies found them? The dungeon beneath the castle was older than the kingdom itself, carved from living rock by hands that had turned to dust centuries ago. Lord Pemberton sat in chains in the deepest cell, his fine clothes torn and stained, but his eyes still held their cold malice. King Aldrich stood before the iron bars, his face impassive. Beside him, Mira clutched a torch, its flickering light casting dancing shadows on the ancient stones. The children are under triple guard now, the king said conversationally. 20 men who've sworn blood oaths to protect them. Even if your associates somehow breach the castle walls, they'll find the task challenging. Pemberton laughed, a sound like breaking glass. You still don't understand, do you? This isn't about a handful of sellswords climbing through windows. The people I work for don't need to breach walls. They already have keys. Mira stepped closer to the bars. What do you mean? I mean, dear woman, that your husband's chest contains evidence of treason that reaches to the very heart of this castle. When that information comes to light, half the king's own council will hang. Pemberton's smile was poisonous, including some who have been protective of you and your children. The king's expression didn't change, but Mira saw his hand tighten on his sword hilt. Name them. Oh, I think not. Let's preserve some mystery for the grand revelation. Pemberton leaned back against the stone wall. But I will tell you this, the chest your blacksmith husband kept so carefully, it's not just evidence of our operations. It's evidence of yours as well, Your Majesty. Explain. The weapons Thomas made, the modifications, the secret compartments. Who do you think commissioned them? Who paid him to create tools for assassination and espionage? Pemberton's eyes glittered in the torchlight. Your own agents, my lord. Your own spy network. Mira felt the world shift around her. That's impossible. Is it? Your husband was very thorough in his record keeping. Every commission, every payment, every conversation, he documented it all. Pemberton's voice dropped to a whisper, including the orders that came directly from the throne. The king was silent for a long moment, his pale eyes unreadable. Finally, he spoke. Even if that were true, it changes nothing. Espionage in defense of the realm is not the same as selling innocent families into slavery. Ah, but the methods are remarkably similar, aren't they? Forged documents, disappeared people, untraceable gold. Pemberton shrugged. The only difference is the justification we tell ourselves. Where is the chest? The king demanded. Now that would be telling. Pemberton settled back with evident satisfaction. But I will say this, you'd better find it before my associates do, because if they reach it first, the revelations will destroy not just you, but your entire kingdom. As they climbed the stairs back to the castle proper, Mira's mind reeled with implications. Is it true about your spy network? The king was quiet until they reached the main corridor. Every kingdom has need of intelligence, information that prevents wars, saves lives, protects the innocent. That's not an answer. He stopped walking and turned to face her. Yes, I have agents who work in shadow to keep this realm safe. Yes, your husband made tools for them, specialized weapons and devices that allowed them to complete their missions. His voice was steady, unflinching. But I have never ordered the enslavement of innocent families for profit. How do I know that's true? The question hung between them like a blade. The king studied her face in the torchlight, and she saw something that might have been pain in his eyes. You don't, he said finally. You can only judge by actions, not words. And my actions regarding you and your children should speak for themselves. Before Mira could respond, Captain Marcus appeared at the end of the corridor, moving with urgent purpose. Your Majesty, Henrik says he's ready to show us the location, but there's a problem. What kind of problem? The old mill where Thomas hid the chest. It's been watched since dawn. At least a dozen armed men, positioned to cover all approaches. The king cursed under his breath. Pemberton's associates work quickly. There's more, Marcus continued grimly. We've identified some of the watchers. They're not common mercenaries. They're soldiers from the northern provinces. Professional cavalry. Whose soldiers? That's what we're trying to determine. But their equipment is expensive, their discipline evident. Someone with significant resources is backing them. Mira felt ice in her veins. If they get the chest, then we lose the only evidence that could expose this conspiracy, the king finished. And Pemberton was right about one thing. Without that evidence, his associates will simply wait for a better opportunity to strike. They made their way to the solar, where Henrik sat nursing a cup of mulled wine and looking every one of his 60-odd years. The rescue had taken its toll on the old smith, but his eyes were still sharp. The mill sits in a valley with only 3 approaches, Henrik explained, gesturing to a rough map he'd sketched. The main road from the east, a hunter's path from the south, and an old logging trail that comes down from the northern ridge. All easily watched, Marcus observed. Aye, Thomas chose the location well. Easy to defend, hard to approach unseen. Henrik's expression was troubled. He buried the chest beneath the mill's foundation stones. There's a loose stone marked with a small cross. The chest is 3 feet down. The king studied the map intently. How long to dig it up? With the right tools? Perhaps an hour. An hour under enemy observation. The king shook his head. We'd be slaughtered before we got halfway. Not necessarily, Mira said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. They're watching for you, for soldiers, armed men, obvious threats. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting they're not watching for a fat Omega woman and her children. Mira's voice was steady despite the fear clawing at her heart. Someone they've already dismissed as harmless. Absolutely not, the king said immediately. Think about it. A mother taking her children to play by the old mill. It's innocent, unthreatening. They might watch, but they wouldn't interfere unless I actually started digging. And when you do start digging, then you attack. Use me as a distraction to get close enough to strike. Mira met his gaze steadily. It's a good plan. It's a plan that puts you and your children directly in harm's way. We're already in harm's way. At least this way, we're doing something about it. Henrik cleared his throat. There might be another option. The mill has a tunnel. Everyone stared at him. What tunnel? The king demanded. Old Smuggler's Route runs from the mill cellar to a cave about half a mile upstream. Thomas showed it to me once, said it was how he moved sensitive materials without being seen. You didn't mention this before. Wasn't sure it was still passable, but if it is, Henrik shrugged. Someone could reach the mill unseen while the watchers focus on the obvious approaches. Captain Marcus leaned forward. How wide is this tunnel? Wide enough for one person, maybe two if they don't mind close quarters. But it's been years since anyone used it. Could be collapsed, flooded, anything. Or it could be our way in, the king mused. Marcus, take a small team and scout this cave. See if the tunnel's passable. And if it is, then we have options. The king's smile was sharp. Henrik, you are coming with us. We'll need you to identify the right foundation stone. Your Majesty, Mira said. What about my suggestion? The distraction? Too dangerous. Everything is dangerous now. Mira's voice carried a note of steel. But sitting here waiting for them to make the next move is the most dangerous option of all. Before the king could respond, a commotion in the courtyard below drew their attention to the window. A rider was approaching at full gallop, his horse lathered with sweat and foam. News from the eastern provinces, Marcus said, recognizing the messenger's colors. The rider's message was brief but devastating. 3 of the slave plantations that had purchased families with forged documents had been attacked in the night. Buildings burned, overseers killed, but the slaves themselves had simply vanished. Someone's cleaning house, the king said grimly, eliminating witnesses. Or rescuing victims, Mira suggested hopefully. Perhaps, but I suspect the former. The king's expression was dark. If Pemberton's associates are willing to murder dozens of people to hide their crimes, he didn't need to finish the thought. Everyone in the room understood the implications. We move tonight, the king decided. Marcus, scout that tunnel. If it's passable, we use it. If not, he looked at Mira, then we consider your distraction plan. And if the tunnel is watched too, Henrik asked, then we fight our way in and hope we're faster than they are. The king's hand rested on his sword hilt, because one way or another that chest is going to see daylight. The afternoon passed in tense preparation. Marcus returned with news that the tunnel was indeed passable, though narrow and partially flooded. A small team could make it through, but they'd arrive soaked and muddy. Perfect conditions for a fight, the king observed dryly. As evening approached, Mira found herself in her chambers, watching her children sleep. Finn had drawn pictures of the castle all afternoon, his young mind fascinated by the tapestries and armor. Sarah had played with the wooden dolls, creating elaborate stories about princesses and dragons. They looked so peaceful, so innocent. The thought of them being used as leverage against her made Mira's blood burn. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. The king entered, carrying 2 items, a leather satchel and a small but wicked-looking knife. If something goes wrong tonight, he said without preamble, use this. He handed her the knife. It's sharp enough to cut rope or leather, small enough to hide. You think I'll need it? I think you've already proven you are more resourceful than anyone gives you credit for. He set the satchel on a chair. That contains gold, papers identifying you as a free citizen, and instructions for reaching the southern kingdoms. If everything falls apart, I'm not running away. You're protecting your children. There's a difference. The king's pale eyes were serious. Mira, what we're attempting tonight, there's a good chance not all of us will come back. Then we better make sure we succeed. He studied her face in the candlelight. You've changed since yesterday. At the auction, you were broken, defeated. Now I'm angry. Mira tucked the knife into her belt. These people destroyed my life, murdered my husband, tried to enslave my children. I was broken then because I thought I was powerless. Now I know I'm not. Power can be dangerous. so can powerlessness. Mira met his gaze steadily. I'd rather die fighting than live in fear. The king nodded slowly. Then we understand each other. As he turned to leave, Mira called after him. Your Majesty, when this is over, when we have the chest and expose this conspiracy, what happens then? Justice, he said simply, for everyone who's been wronged. Even for those who worked in your spy network, if the chest contains evidence of their crimes? The king paused in the doorway. Justice isn't always the same as punishment, Mira. Sometimes it's about truth. Sometimes it's about making sure the right people pay for the right crimes. After he left, Mira sat by the fire, thinking about justice and truth and the fine lines between them. Tomorrow, if they succeeded, she would finally learn the full scope of her husband's secret life. She would discover who had ordered his death and why. But tonight, she had to survive long enough to ask those questions. Outside her window, the moon was rising, a thin crescent that provided little light. Perfect weather for skulking through tunnels and stealing buried secrets. Perfect weather for ending this nightmare once and for all. She kissed her sleeping children and whispered a prayer to whatever gods watched over mothers and fools. Then she checked the knife at her belt one more time and prepared to discover just how far she was willing to go for justice. The old mill waited in its valley, surrounded by enemies and secrets. Soon, one way or another, those secrets would be revealed. But as Mira prepared to leave her chambers, she couldn't shake the feeling that the chest they sought contained more than just evidence of conspiracy. Pemberton's words echoed in her mind. Evidence that would destroy not just criminals, but the king himself. What if Thomas had documented something that would tear the kingdom apart? What if the truth, when it finally came to light, proved more dangerous than the lies? Some questions, she realized, could only be answered in darkness and mud, surrounded by enemies who would kill to keep their secrets buried. Tonight she would find out if truth was worth dying for. The answer, she suspected, lay 3 feet beneath a foundation stone marked with a cross, waiting in the dark like judgment itself. The cave entrance was little more than a crack in the hillside, hidden behind a curtain of thorny vines that caught at clothing and drew blood. King Aldrich crouched beside it, his dark armor replaced by plain leather and wool that would make less noise in the tunnel's confines. Last chance to reconsider, he murmured to the small group gathered around him. Besides the king, only 3 others would make the journey through the smuggler's tunnel. Henrik, Captain Marcus, and, despite every argument against it, Mira herself. She had insisted, and when Henrik supported her by saying he might need help identifying the right foundation stone in darkness, the king had finally relented. The Watchers are still in position, Marcus reported, returning from a final scouting mission. 12 that we can see, probably more hidden. They're not taking any chances. Good, the king said grimly. Overconfidence would have been harder to work with. They had left the remaining guards with strict orders to protect the children and watch for any signs of attack on the castle. If this was an elaborate trap designed to draw the king away from his stronghold, at least the most innocent targets would remain defended. The tunnel entrance was even narrower than Henrik had warned. They had to crawl on hands and knees for the first 100 yards, the ancient stone walls pressing close on either side. The air was thick with the smell of centuries-old dampness and things that preferred to remain undisturbed. How did smugglers ever use this regularly? Mira whispered, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. Very carefully, Henrik replied from somewhere behind her. And probably not often. This was always meant as a last resort. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the tunnel widened enough for them to move in a crouch. Water seeped through cracks in the ceiling, creating puddles that soaked through their clothes and made every step treacherous. The king, leading the way with a shielded lantern, suddenly raised his hand for silence. Ahead, a faint sound echoed through the tunnel, voices muffled but audible. They crept forward until light became visible around a bend in the passage. The king extinguished their lantern and motioned for absolute quiet. Told you there's nothing down here but rats and old bones, a voice was saying. Captain's orders were to check every approach, another replied. That includes this rat hole. Mira's heart sank. The tunnel had been discovered. The king drew his sword with infinite care, the blade sliding from its sheath in perfect silence. Behind him, Marcus did the same, but in the narrow confines of the tunnel, there would be no room for proper swordplay. "Found something," the first voice called out. "Looks like recent footprints in the mud." "How recent?" "Hard to say. Could be hours, could be days." The sound of movement echoed through the tunnel, men shifting position, weapons being readied. The king tensed, preparing to strike. Then Henrik did something unexpected. He pressed past Mira and Marcus with surprising agility for his age, moving toward the voices with purpose. "Hello there," he called out cheerfully, as though encountering armed men in a smuggler's tunnel was the most natural thing in the world. "Don't suppose you fellows have seen my cat?" The startled exclamations from ahead were almost comical. "Who? What are you doing down here, old man?" "Looking for my cat, as I said," Henrik replied, stepping into the circle of torchlight ahead. "Tibbles ran off this morning, and I tracked her to this cave. Stubborn creature. Always getting into places she shouldn't." Mira could see the guards now, 2 men in leather armor, swords drawn but lowered in confusion. They clearly hadn't expected to find a harmless old man searching for his pet. "This tunnel is off limits," one of them said, though he seemed uncertain about how to proceed. "Oh, I'm sorry about that," Henrik said apologetically. "I didn't know anyone owned it." "Is it your tunnel, then?" We're guarding it," the second man said. "Guarding it from what? Cats?" Henrik chuckled. "Well, I suppose if you haven't seen Tibbles, I should keep looking. She's probably found her way to the mill by now. Always liked to hunt mice around old buildings." The guards exchanged glances. "You can't go to the mill, old man. It's dangerous." "Dangerous? How so?" "There are bandits in the area, armed men." "Bandits?" Henrik's voice rose with apparent alarm. "Well, that settles it then. I'll just have to go back and hope Tibbles finds her own way home. Thank you for the warning, lads." He turned to go, then paused, as if struck by a thought. "You wouldn't happen to have a bit of rope, would you? The way back is treacherous, and these old bones aren't as steady as they used to be." One of the guards, apparently feeling sorry for the harmless old man, produced a coil of rope from his belt. "Here, but be careful, and don't come back this way. It's not safe." "You're very kind," Henrik said, accepting the rope gratefully. "May fortune smile on you both." He disappeared back into the darkness, and after a moment the guards resumed their positions. But their attention was now focused on the tunnel entrance, watching for the old man's emergence rather than looking deeper into the passage. Henrik rejoined them several minutes later, grinning broadly despite the danger. "Sometimes," he whispered, "the best disguise is being exactly what you appear to be." "Brilliant," the king murmured. "But now we know the tunnel is compromised." "Not entirely," Henrik replied. "There's a side passage about 50 yards ahead, old drainage channel. It's even narrower than this, but it leads directly under the mill's foundation." They continued forward, moving even more carefully now. The side passage Henrik mentioned was indeed narrow, barely wide enough for one person to crawl through. Worse, it was half filled with stagnant water that smelled of decay and things better left unidentified. "I'm beginning to understand why smugglers found other work," Marcus muttered as they slithered through the muck. The drainage channel seemed to go on forever, winding through the hillside like the burrow of some massive worm. Just when Mira thought she couldn't bear another minute in the cramped, stinking space, Henrik called softly from ahead. "Here, we're under the mill." They emerged into a natural cavern beneath the building's foundation, their clothes soaked and reeking. Above them, ancient stones formed the mill's base, fitted together with the skill of craftsmen long dead. "The marked stone should be..." Henrik played his lantern over the foundation, searching. "There, that one." The cross was small and almost invisible, carved into a stone about 3 feet from the cavern floor. But when the king pressed his shoulder against it, the stone shifted slightly. "It's loose," he confirmed, "but we'll need tools to move it properly." Marcus produced a small pry bar from his pack. "This should do it." Working the stone free was slow, careful work. Any sound might alert the guards above, and a stone falling would create noise that would bring immediate investigation. But finally the marked stone came free, revealing a dark cavity behind it. "Can you reach it?" the king asked. Henrik, being the smallest, worked his arm into the space. I feel something. Leather wrapping. Got it. The chest Henrik withdrew was smaller than Mira had expected, about the size of a large book. But it was heavy, and the iron bindings were elaborate, clearly the work of a master craftsman. Thomas always did beautiful work, Henrik murmured, running his fingers over the intricate lock. Can you open it? Not here. We need proper light and tools and time to work without listening for footsteps. Henrik wrapped the chest in his cloak. But this is it, Thomas's insurance policy. Getting back through the drainage channel with the chest proved even more challenging than the trip in. The extra weight threw off their balance in the narrow space, and the fear of dropping their prize into the stagnant water made every movement agonizing. But finally they reached the main tunnel again. The guards were still at their post, but Henrik's earlier performance had lulled them into thinking the only threat was a harmless old man looking for his cat. They made it back to the cave entrance just as dawn was breaking over the hillside. The ride back to the castle was tense. They had the chest, but they also knew that Pemberton's associates would soon discover their prize was missing. How long before they realize we have it? Mira asked as they approached the castle gates. Not long, the king replied grimly, which means we need to open that chest immediately and discover what secrets your husband died protecting. The solar had been cleared of everyone except the 4 who had made the journey and 2 guards sworn to absolute secrecy. The chest sat on the king's desk, its iron bindings and elaborate lock gleaming in the morning light. The lock is beautiful work, Henrik admitted, examining it closely. But Thomas was thorough. It won't open without the right key or considerable damage to the contents. Then we find the key, Mira said. Thomas must have hidden it somewhere. Actually, Henrik said slowly, I think I know where it is. He reached into his leather apron and withdrew a small, intricately carved key that he wore on a chain around his neck. Thomas gave me this years ago, said it was for emergencies. I thought it was just a token of friendship. But now, though, he held it up to the lock. The shapes match. The key turned smoothly and the chest opened with a soft click. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were dozens of documents, letters, contracts, detailed drawings, and what appeared to be a bound journal written in Thomas's careful hand. The king lifted out the journal first, scanning the opening pages. His expression grew darker with each line he read. What does it say? Mira asked. Everything, the king replied quietly. Names, dates, payments, assignments. Your husband documented every commission he ever received, legitimate and otherwise. He turned to a section marked with a ribbon. Here, orders for modified weapons, paid for by Lord Pemberton and 6 others. The modifications were designed to make assassinations look like accidents. Assassination weapons, Marcus said grimly. But look at this. The king flipped to another section. These orders came directly from my spy master, Sir Roderick. Hidden compartments in diplomatic pouches, false bottoms in trunks, concealed blade sheaths. He looked up. Legitimate spy work. The 2 operations used the same craftsman, Henrik observed. Because Thomas was the best at what he did, the king continued reading, but he began to suspect that some of his legitimate clients were connected to the illegal operation. Mira leaned forward. What kind of connections? The king's voice was deadly quiet as he read. Sir Roderick commissioned a set of diplomatic pouches with false compartments in spring of last year. 3 months later, Lord Pemberton ordered similar modifications to a merchant's strongbox. Thomas noted this similarity and began investigating. He turned the page. Here, Thomas discovered that several items he'd made for the Crown's agents were being copied and used by criminals. Someone with access to royal commissions was sharing information with Pemberton's network. Sir Roderick, Marcus said, it appears so, but there's more. The king lifted out a separate bundle of letters. Correspondence between Pemberton and someone identified only as the architect. They discussed not just individual crimes, but a systematic plan to destabilize the kingdom's economy through selective targeting of skilled craftsmen and minor merchants. Mira's blood ran cold. They weren't just stealing people for profit, they were trying to damage the kingdom itself. By removing key people from the economy, creating shortages, driving up prices, the king nodded grimly. Economic warfare. And look here, this letter mentions northern allies who will benefit from the chaos. The soldiers Marcus identified, Henrik said. This goes beyond our kingdom's borders. The king continued reading, his expression growing more troubled. Thomas suspected he was in danger. This final entry is dated just days before his death. He mentions meeting with Sir Roderick to discuss irregularities in recent commissions. And then he died, Mira whispered. Of a fever that came on suddenly and killed him in 2 days, the king confirmed. How convenient. A commotion in the courtyard below drew their attention to the window. A large party of riders was approaching the gates, at least 30 men in the colors of the northern provinces. They've come for the chest, Marcus observed. Or for us, the king replied. He quickly gathered the documents. Captain, alert the guard, full defensive positions, and send word to our allies. We may need them before this is over. As Marcus hurried out, the king turned to Mira and Henrik. There's something else in here, something Thomas marked as most urgent. He showed them a sealed letter marked with Thomas's personal seal. Inside, in the blacksmith's careful script, was a single devastating paragraph. If you are reading this, then I am dead, and my suspicions were correct. The architect is not who he appears to be. The man coordinating this network of criminals is Sir Roderick himself, the king's own spymaster. He has been selling royal secrets to northern agents while using his position to eliminate anyone who might expose him. The evidence is in the hidden compartment of the diplomatic pouch he commissioned, the one with the rose seal. Find it before he destroys it, or the kingdom will fall from within. The silence that followed was deafening. The king's spymaster, the man responsible for the kingdom's intelligence network, was the architect of a conspiracy that had destroyed dozens of families and threatened the realm's stability. How do we find this diplomatic pouch? Mira asked. It would be in Roderick's possession, or hidden somewhere in his quarters, the king replied. But his expression was troubled. The problem is, Roderick disappeared 3 days ago. Officially, he's on a secret mission to the Eastern Kingdoms. Unofficially, he may be preparing to flee with whatever intelligence he can steal. The king moved to the window, watching as the northern riders approached. And if he's allied with whoever sent these soldiers, the sound of horns from the castle walls interrupted his thoughts. The traditional greeting for diplomatic envoys, but played with an urgent edge that suggested immediate attention was required. We have visitors, the king said grimly, and I suspect they're not here for a social call. As if summoned by his words, a servant appeared at the solar door. Your Majesty, there's an envoy from the northern provinces requesting immediate audience. He says it's a matter of urgent diplomatic importance. I'll bet he does, the king muttered. Then louder, send him up, but keep the guard close. The envoy who appeared minutes later was a tall, elegant man in rich furs and silver-chased armor. His smile was polite, but his eyes were cold as winter. Your Majesty, he said, bowing just deep enough to avoid insult. I am Lord Commander Vance, representative of the Northern Alliance. I come seeking the return of stolen property. What stolen property would that be? Documents and materials belonging to our mutual friend, Sir Roderick. They were taken from his quarters without authorization during his absence. The king's expression didn't change. I'm afraid I don't know what you're referring to. Of course not, Vance replied smoothly. Perhaps I should be more specific. We're looking for a certain chest, iron-bound, with an elaborate lock that was recently removed from its hiding place near the old mill. So much for keeping their success secret. And what makes you think such a chest exists? The king asked. Because we've been watching for it, because Sir Roderick told us exactly where to find it, and because the men we had guarding it are now very upset about its disappearance. Vance's smile turned predatory. Shall we dispense with the pretense, Your Majesty? We know you have it, we know what it contains, and we're prepared to offer a very generous arrangement for its return. What kind of arrangement? Safe passage for you and your household to the southern kingdoms. Gold enough to live comfortably for the rest of your days. And most importantly, Vance's eyes found Mira, the continued safety of certain newly acquired dependents. The threat was unmistakable. Mira felt her hand move instinctively to the knife at her belt. And if I refuse? The king asked. then we will be forced to take more direct action. The Northern Alliance has legitimate grievances against this kingdom's interference in regional affairs. Our armies are already massing at the border, waiting for words of your cooperation. You're threatening war over a chest of documents? We're preventing war by ensuring those documents never see daylight, Vance corrected. The revelations they contain would destabilize three kingdoms and destroy the careful balance we've spent years creating. The king was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes studying the northern envoy. Finally, he spoke. You're right about one thing. We do have the chest, and we know exactly what it contains. Vance's smile widened. Then we have an understanding? We understand that Sir Roderick has been selling royal secrets to foreign powers while orchestrating a criminal conspiracy that destroyed innocent families for profit. The king's voice was deadly quiet. We understand that you represent not legitimate diplomatic interests, but foreign agents seeking to cover their crimes. Vance's pretense of civility finally cracked. You have no idea what you're interfering with, Boy King. This is larger than your small realm, more important than your petty notions of justice. Perhaps, but it ends here. The king moved to the door. Captain Marcus, arrest Lord Commander Vance on charges of espionage and conspiracy. Vance's hand dropped to his sword. I think not. But he never got the weapon clear of its sheath. Mira, moving with desperate speed, buried her knife in his shoulder. The Northern Lord stumbled, his sword clattering to the floor. That's for my children, she said grimly. As Marcus and his guards secured the wounded envoy, the king turned to the window. Below, the Northern riders were in disarray, their leaders' capture throwing their plans into chaos. They'll attack, Marcus warned. Let them try. The walls are strong, and we have allies coming. The king's smile was cold. Besides, we have what they really want. But even as he spoke, new concerns were forming. If Sir Roderick was truly allied with foreign powers, if this conspiracy reached as high as they suspected, then exposing it might indeed destabilize the kingdom. What if they're right? Mira asked quietly. What if revealing the truth does more harm than good? The king studied the documents spread across his desk, evidence of murder, slavery, treason, and foreign interference. Evidence that could destroy lives and kingdoms alike. Then we find a third option, he said finally. Justice doesn't always require public revelation. Sometimes it requires more targeted solutions. His meaning was clear. Some of the conspirators would face public trial and execution. Others might simply disappear, their crimes known only to those who mattered. But first, they had to survive the immediate threat. Outside, the Northern Riders were regrouping, and more forces were undoubtedly on the way. The siege was about to begin. The first arrows came at dawn, whistling over the castle walls like deadly birds. Mira pressed herself against the stone parapet, her heart hammering as she watched the Northern forces spread across the valley below, like a dark stain on the autumn grass. 300 men, maybe more, Captain Marcus reported grimly. Professional soldiers, siege equipment, and they're setting up for a long campaign. King Aldrich studied the enemy positions through a spyglass, his expression unreadable. They're not here to negotiate. This is conquest disguised as diplomacy. Below in the courtyard, servants hurried to prepare the castle's defenses. Water barrels were filled, weapons distributed, and livestock herded into the inner bailey. The preparations had the practiced efficiency of people who had faced siege before. How long can we hold? Mira asked. Months, if necessary, the king replied. This castle has never been taken by force. But we're not dealing with ordinary enemies. The king lowered his spyglass. If Sir Roderick has been feeding them intelligence about our defenses, they may know weaknesses we're not aware of. A commotion at the gatehouse drew their attention. A small party was approaching under a flag of truce. 3 riders in northern colors, led by a man Mira didn't recognize. Another envoy? Marcus asked. Or the same message delivered by someone new, the king said. Let's hear what they have to say. The new envoy proved to be cut from different cloth than Lord Commander Vance. Where Vance had been polished and diplomatic, this man was blunt and military. He introduced himself as General Corrin and wasted no time on pleasantries. You have 1 hour to surrender the stolen documents and submit to Northern justice. he announced from beneath the castle walls. After that, we will take what we came for by force. And what justice would that be? The king called down from the battlements. The justice of necessity, Corin replied. Those documents threaten the stability of 3 kingdoms in the peace we've worked to maintain. They must be destroyed. Even if they contain evidence of murder and slavery? Especially then. Corin's voice was hard. Some truths are too dangerous to be revealed. Some price is too high to pay for justice. The king considered this. And if we refuse, then we will demonstrate that the Northern Alliance protects its interests by any means necessary. Corin gestured to the assembled forces. One castle, no matter how strong, cannot stand against an army. We shall see. After the envoy departed, the king gathered his war council in the Great Hall. Besides Marcus and the castle's senior officers, the group included Henrik and, to Mira's surprise, herself. You've proven yourself, the king explained when she questioned her inclusion. And this war began with your family's suffering. You have a right to help decide how it ends. The strategic situation was grim but not hopeless. The castle's walls were strong, the garrison well-trained, and supplies sufficient for a long siege. But the enemy had numbers and potentially inside knowledge of their defenses. Our best hope is relief forces from our allies, Marcus reported. Messages have been sent, but it will be days before they can arrive. If they come at all, one of the older knights said grimly, the Northern Alliance has been courting our neighbors. Some may decide neutrality is safer than loyalty. Then we hold alone, the king said simply. We've done it before. Not against an enemy who knows our secrets, another officer pointed out. If Sir Roderick truly has been feeding them intelligence, then we adapt. The king's voice was firm. We change what can be changed and prepare for what cannot. The first assault came that afternoon, a probing attack designed to test the castle's defenses rather than break them. Ladders appeared against the walls, accompanied by flights of arrows that forced the defenders to keep their heads down. Mira found herself assigned to help tend the wounded, a task for which her experience as a mother had inadvertently prepared her. The first casualties were light, mostly arrow wounds and cuts from the brief fighting when attackers reached the walls, but they were only the beginning. This is just to see how we respond, Henrik explained as they worked to bandage a guard's shoulder. The old smith had proven surprisingly useful in the medical stations, his steady hands and calm manner helping to reassure the wounded. How do you know so much about warfare? Mira asked. I wasn't always a blacksmith, Henrik replied quietly. Before I settled down, I was a soldier, fought in the border wars 20 years ago. That explained his composure under fire. It also explained why Thomas had trusted him with dangerous secrets. The probing attacks continued for 3 days, each one revealing a little more about the castle's defenses. The northern forces were methodical, professional, and patient, qualities that made them far more dangerous than an impetuous enemy seeking quick victory. On the 4th morning, the real assault began. It started before dawn with a bombardment from siege engines, catapults that hurled stones and fire at the walls with mechanical precision. The ancient stones held, but the constant hammering was meant to wear down both fortifications and defenders' nerves. Then came the ladders, dozens of them, while archers filled the air with arrows. This time the attackers pressed their assault seriously, seeking to overwhelm sections of the wall through sheer numbers. Mira watched from the keep's upper windows as the battle raged below. The castle's garrison fought with desperate courage, but they were outnumbered and the enemy was well prepared. They're concentrating on the eastern wall, the king observed, joining her at the window. His armor was dented and blood-stained from his own part in the fighting. Is that significant? That's where the old drainage system runs closest to the surface. If they break through there, he didn't need to finish. Mira had seen enough sieges in tavern tales to know that once attackers gained the walls, the battle was usually over. But the eastern wall held, and eventually the assault wave broke against it like water against stone. The northern forces pulled back, leaving their dead scattered on the bloodied ground. That was just the first attempt, Marcus reported wearily. They'll try again tonight or tomorrow, or whenever they think we're weakest. How many did we lose? The king asked. 12 dead, 23 wounded, but we can't sustain losses like that for long. The king nodded grimly. Then we need to end this quickly. That night, he gathered a small group in the solar, Solar, Marcus, Henrik, Mira, and three of his most trusted knights. On the table lay Thomas's journal and the other documents from the chest, along with maps of the surrounding area. We have two choices, the king said without preamble. We can continue to defend these walls until relief arrives or our supplies run out. Or we can go on the offensive. Offensive? One of the knights asked. Against an army? Against their leadership. The king pointed to the enemy camp, visible through the windows as scattered points of light in the darkness. General Corrin is competent, but he's not the real power here. The real decisions are being made by whoever sent him. Sir Roderick, Mira said, most likely, and if he's here, if we can capture him, the king's smile was sharp. Then we have leverage. A night raid on their camp, Marcus mused. Dangerous, but not impossible. More than dangerous, Henrik warned. It's nearly suicidal. Their camp will be heavily guarded. And even if you succeed in capturing Roderick, you still have to get back alive. Which is why I'm not sending soldiers, the king has said quietly. I'm going myself. The protests were immediate and heated. A king couldn't risk himself in such a venture. The succession would be thrown into chaos if he died. The castle needed his leadership. The king listened patiently, then raised his hand for silence. This began with betrayal from within my own council. It has cost innocent families their freedom and lives. It threatens the stability of the kingdom itself. His pale eyes were hard as winter ice. I will end it personally or die in the attempt. Then I'm coming with you, Mira said. Every head turned toward her. The king's expression was incredulous. Absolutely not. You'll need someone who knows Sir Roderick by sight, someone who can identify him in the dark, in disguise, under stress. Mira's voice was steady despite her fear. I've seen him. He came to our cottage twice when Thomas was alive. Business-like visits that seemed innocent at the time. That doesn't qualify you for a suicide mission. Neither does being king, she shot back. But you're going anyway. The argument continued for an hour, but eventually practical necessity won out. Mira was right about being able to identify Roderick, and the small raiding party would need every advantage they could get. The plan they developed was simple, which made it slightly less suicidal, but not much safer. A small group would leave through the old drainage tunnel that had allowed them to reach the mill. They would circle around to approach the enemy camp from the north, where the terrain offered the best concealment. Once in the camp, they would locate Roderick and extract him if possible. If extraction proved impossible, they would at least confirm his presence and try to gather intelligence about enemy plans. And if everything goes wrong, Marcus asked? Then we die knowing we tried, the king replied simply. They left the castle at midnight, using the same tunnel that had served them at the mill. This time, the passage felt even more cramped and treacherous, but they emerged safely into the night air. The enemy camp lay spread across the valley like a small city, complete with guard posts, supply wagons, and command tents. Approaching unseen would require all their skill and more luck than they had any right to expect. But they had one advantage, Sir Roderick's own intelligence network. If he was truly coordinating with the northern forces, he would be in the command area, close to the senior officers. It took them 2 hours to work their way around to the north side of the camp, moving like shadows through the darkness. The sentries were alert but not expecting infiltration. Most of their attention was focused on the castle walls. There, Mira whispered, pointing to a large tent near the center of the camp. That one has extra guards. The king studied the layout through a spyglass. 6 guards, maybe more inside. Command tent, almost certainly. How do we get close enough to see who's in there? Very carefully. They spent another hour working their way through the camp's outer perimeter. The enemy soldiers were disciplined, but not paranoid. They expected attack from the castle walls, not from shadows within their own lines. Finally, they reached the command area. The large tent was indeed heavily guarded, and through gaps in the fabric, they could see the flicker of lamplight and hear the murmur of voices. Wait here, the king whispered. I'll get closer and try to see inside. But before he could move, the tent flap opened and a figure emerged into the firelight. Mira's blood froze as she recognized the tall, scholarly form of Sir Roderick, the king's own spy master, very much alive and apparently in command of enemy operations. Tomorrow's assault will focus on the northern gate, Roderick was saying to the officers who accompanied him. The drainage system there is the castle's weakest point. I helped design the fortifications, so I should know. And if they attempt another sortie by Anserni? General Corin asked. They won't. Aldrich is too cautious for such risks, and he lacks the men for a meaningful offensive. Roderick's smile was cold. By week's end, we'll have the castle and the documents both. What about the woman and her children? Your report suggested they might prove useful. Leverage, nothing more. Once we have the evidence destroyed and Aldrich dead, his noble supporters will be more tractable if we hold a few innocent hostages. Roderick shrugged. Though I suppose they might simply disappear if they prove inconvenient. Mira's hands clenched into fists. This man had orchestrated her family's destruction, murdered her husband, and now spoke casually of killing her children. The knife at her belt seemed to burn against her skin. The king's hand on her arm stopped her from doing something foolish. Wait, he breathed. Let them finish. The Northern Alliance appreciates your flexibility regarding civilian casualties, Corin was saying, though some of our ally question the necessity of such measures. Squeamishness, Roderick replied dismissively. This operation has required distasteful choices from the beginning. The slave trade, the forged documents, the eliminated witnesses, all necessary to maintain operational security. And the king's spy network, your own people, will be blamed for everything once Aldrich is dead, a convenient scapegoat for crimes they never committed. Roderick's laugh was ugly. History is written by survivors, General. We must simply ensure we are among them. The king had heard enough. He signaled the retreat, and they began working their way back through the enemy lines. But they had only gone a few hundred yards when shouts erupted behind them. Intruders in the camp! Alert the guard! Someone had spotted them. Within moments, the entire camp was alive with running soldiers and blazing torches. Their careful infiltration had become a desperate fight for survival. The tunnel! Marcus shouted over the growing chaos. Make for the drainage tunnel! They ran through the darkness with the enemy in pursuit, arrows whistling past their heads and torches spreading behind them like wildfire. The tunnel entrance had never seemed so far away. Henrik stumbled, his age finally telling against him. Mira grabbed his arm, half carrying the old smith as they fled. Behind them, the pursuit was closing in. Leave me, Henrik gasped. Save yourselves. Not a chance, Mira replied grimly, remembering all the times this man had helped her family. They reached the tunnel entrance with barely yards to spare. Marcus and the king formed a rear guard, holding off the pursuing soldiers while Mira got Henrik into the passage. Arrows struck the stone around the entrance, sending up sparks and chips of rock. Go, the king shouted. We'll be right behind you. Mira plunged into the tunnel's darkness, Henrik leaning heavily on her shoulder. Behind them, she could hear the clash of steel as their friends fought to buy them time. The journey back seemed to take forever. Henrik's breathing was labored, and she could feel him weakening with each step. But finally, miraculously, they emerged into the castle's hidden chambers. Marcus appeared moments later, supporting a wounded knight. Then the king, his sword bloody, but his eyes alive with grim satisfaction. Did we learn anything worth the risk? Marcus asked as they collapsed in the safety of the keep. We learned that Sir Roderick is very much alive and in command of enemy operations, the king replied. We learned that he plans to blame his own spy network for the conspiracy after I'm dead. And we learned that he considers Myra and her children expendable leverage. So what do we do with this information? The king was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the enemy fires that now burned even brighter in the valley below. When he spoke, his voice was deadly calm. We use it to destroy him. Tomorrow, Sir Roderick expects another defensive battle. Instead, he's going to get a very unpleasant surprise. What kind of surprise? Mira asked. The king's smile was sharp as a blade. The kind that ends with traitors getting exactly what they deserve. But even as he spoke, new complications were arising. The failed infiltration had alerted the enemy to their capabilities, and General Corin was no fool. The northern forces would be more cautious now, more alert to unconventional tactics. Worse, time was running out. Food supplies were holding, but ammunition was running low, and the constant strain of siege warfare was wearing down the defenders. Relief had to come soon, or the castle would fall regardless of their plans for revenge. In the distance, enemy drums began to beat, the rhythm of preparation for another assault. By dawn, the northern forces would attack again, and this time they would be ready for surprises. The final battle was approaching, and with it, the last chance to expose the conspiracy that had destroyed so many innocent lives. Justice, Mira realized, would be paid for in blood. The only question was whose. The final assault came with the dawn, heralded by a bombardment that shook the ancient stones of the castle like thunder. Mira hugged her children close in the keep's inner chamber, whispering reassurances she wasn't sure she believed while the world exploded around them. "Mama, are we going to die?" Sarah asked, her small voice barely audible over the crash of catapult stones. "No, sweetheart," Mira said firmly. "The king promised to protect us, and he keeps his promises." She hoped that was true. The plan the king had outlined the night before was audacious to the point of madness, a gamble that would either end the siege in victory or see them all dead by sunset. Above them, she could hear the clash of steel and the shouts of fighting men as the northern forces pressed their assault. This time they weren't probing or testing, they were coming with everything they had. "The eastern wall is holding," Captain Marcus reported breathlessly when he appeared at the chamber door. "But barely. They've got ladders up in 3 places and more siege towers approaching." "And the northern gate?" "Under heavy pressure. Roderick was right about it being our weak point. The drainage system has compromised the foundation stones." Marcus wiped blood from a cut on his forehead. "We can't hold much longer." The king appeared behind him, his armor dented and his sword notched from heavy fighting. "Then it's time to spring our trap. Marcus, signal the retreat from the northern gate. Make it look convincing. Panic, disorder, men fleeing in terror." "Your Majesty, if we actually lose the gate, we won't, trust me." The king's pale eyes were hard as winter steel. "And make sure Sir Roderick sees the retreat. I want him confident when he comes through that gate." Marcus nodded and disappeared back into the chaos above. The king turned to Mira, his expression softening slightly. "Are you ready for this?" Mira checked the knife at her belt and nodded. "I've been ready since the auction block. Remember, stay hidden until you see my signal. No matter what happens, no matter what you hear, don't reveal yourself until then. And if something goes wrong, then you take your children and run. Henrik knows the escape routes. He'll get you to safety." The old smith stepped forward from where he'd been checking his own weapons. Despite his age, he'd insisted on taking part in the final gambit. "Nothing's going wrong," he said gruffly. "We've come too far to fail now." The sounds of battle grew closer, more desperate. Shouts echoed in the corridors as the defenders fell back from the northern gate, their retreat so convincing that even Mira found herself believing it. "It's working," the king said, watching from a high window. "Roderick's forces are pouring through the breach. He's with them. I can see his banner." The next few minutes were the longest of Mira's life. She crouched in the shadows of an alcove near the great hall, her children safely hidden in a priest's hole deeper in the keep, while enemy soldiers flooded through the castle's corridors. The sound of their triumphant shouts made her skin crawl. Finally, she heard the voice she had learned to hate more than any other. "Secure the keep," Sir Roderick was commanding. "Find the king and the woman. I want them alive for questioning." "What about the children?" another voice asked. "Kill them. They're no longer useful." Rage flared in Mira's chest, so hot and pure it nearly drove her from concealment. But she forced herself to wait, to trust in the king's plan. The great hall filled with enemy soldiers, their weapons drawn and their faces flushed with victory. At their head walked Sir Roderick, no longer bothering to hide his true allegiance. He wore northern colors now, and his smile was cold as a grave. "Where is he?" Roderick demanded of a captured castle guard. "Where is your precious king hiding?" "Go to hell," the guard spat. Roderick drew his sword and ran the man through without hesitation. "I have no patience for heroics. The castle is taken. Your cause is lost." "Where is King Aldrich?" "Right here." The voice came from the hall's upper gallery, Every head turned to see the king step into view, his armor gleaming in the torchlight. He was alone, apparently trapped, with nowhere to run. Roderick's smile widened. Aldrich, finally, I was beginning to think you'd died in the fighting. Not yet, though the day is young. Indeed it is. Roderick gestured to his soldiers. Seize him. But as the men moved forward, the king raised his hand. Before you do, don't you want to gloat? Don't you want to explain how clever you have been? Roderick paused, clearly tempted by the offer. Why would I waste time on explanations? Because you've won, the king said simply. Because after all these months of careful planning, of playing multiple sides against each other, you deserve to savor your victory. The flattery worked. Roderick straightened, his chest swelling with pride. Very well, but briefly, I have a kingdom to reorganize. By all means, enlighten me. How long have you been working against the crown? Years, Roderick replied. Ever since it became clear that your father's policies were leading to economic stagnation. The northern kingdoms offered alternative arrangements that would benefit all parties, except for the families you destroyed. Regrettable but necessary, the blacksmith and his kind were security risks. They knew too much about our operations. Roderick shrugged. Besides, the slave trade provided useful funding for our activities. And the forged documents, the corrupted magistrates, all part of maintaining operational security. We couldn't have inconvenient questions being asked at inconvenient times. Roderick's smile was poisonous. Really, Aldrich? You should appreciate the elegance of it. Your own intelligence network turned against you by the man you trusted most. I do appreciate it, the king said quietly, almost as much as I appreciate this. He raised his hand again, but this time it wasn't a gesture of surrender. It was a signal. The great hall erupted into chaos as hidden panels opened throughout the room. The king's guard poured from concealment, not the defeated remnants of a broken garrison, but fresh, well-armed soldiers who had been waiting for exactly this moment. The northern forces, caught completely off guard, tried to rally but found themselves trapped in a killing box. The retreat from the gates had been a ruse, drawing the enemy into the castle's heart, where they could be surrounded and destroyed. Sir Roderick's face went white as he realized the trap. Impossible. My intelligence, your intelligence was what I wanted you to know, the king said, leaping down from the gallery with his sword in hand. Did you really think I wouldn't realize that my own spy master was feeding information to our enemies? The fighting was brief but vicious. The northern soldiers were professionals, but they were outnumbered and caught in an impossible position. Within minutes, most were dead or surrendered. Sir Roderick himself tried to fight his way to an exit, but found his path blocked by an unexpected obstacle. Mira standing in the doorway with her knife drawn and murder in her eyes. Remember me, Westy? She asked conversationally. The fat Omega from the auction block? The one whose children you plan to kill? Roderick's eyes widened with recognition and fear. You're supposed to be hiding. I was, but then I heard you give the order to murder my children, and I decided I had other priorities. Mira's voice was deadly calm. Did you know that my husband kept detailed records of everyone who commissioned his work, including you? That's impossible. I was careful. You were arrogant. You thought Thomas was just a simple blacksmith who wouldn't ask inconvenient questions. But he documented everything, every meeting, every conversation, every piece you commissioned for your spy work. Mira stepped closer, her knife glinting. Including the night you came to our cottage to threaten him. The memory was crystallizing now, details she had buried coming back with perfect clarity. You told him that people who knew too much about sensitive projects sometimes had accidents. You said it would be unfortunate if anything happened to his family. Roderick backed against the wall, his sword wavering. He was becoming a security risk. He was a good man trying to provide for his family, and you murdered him for it. The fever was natural. The fever was poison, Mira said flatly. Slow acting, hard to detect, designed to look like a natural death. But Thomas suspected at the end. He made Henrik promise to tell me if anything seemed suspicious about his death. She was close enough now to see the sweat beading on Roderick's forehead. He also made Henrik promise to take care of his family if anything happened. That's why Henrik helped hide us when the tax collectors came. That's why he tried to get us away before your forged documents could be used. You can't prove any of this. I don't have to prove it in court, Mira replied. I just have to prove it to myself. She struck faster than a snake, her knife slicing across Roderick's throat in one smooth motion. The traitor dropped his sword, clutching at the wound as his life poured out between his fingers. That's for Thomas, Mira said quietly, and for every family you destroyed. Roderick collapsed, his eyes already glazing. Around the great hall, the last of the fighting was ending as the surviving northern soldiers threw down their weapons in surrender. King Aldrich approached slowly, his expression unreadable. I was going to take him alive for questioning. He'd already confessed to everything that mattered, Mira replied, cleaning her knife on Roderick's cloak. And some crimes deserve immediate justice. The king nodded slowly. Indeed they do. The aftermath of the battle was swift but thorough. General Corin, captured when his forces found themselves cut off from retreat, proved more reasonable than his late ally. Faced with evidence of Sir Roderick's treachery and the complete failure of his mission, he agreed to negotiate rather than face annihilation. The Northern Alliance was deceived, he claimed during the discussions that followed. We believed we were supporting a legitimate intelligence operation against a hostile neighbor. And the slave trade? The murdered families? The king asked coldly. Regrettable excesses by a rogue agent, Corin replied smoothly. The Alliance had no knowledge of such activities. It was a transparent lie, but one that served everyone's interests. The Northern forces would withdraw immediately, taking their surviving men and equipment. In exchange, the king would not demand reparations or launch retaliatory raids against Northern territories. The real justice would come later, in quieter ways. The documents from Thomas's chest had revealed a network of corruption that extended far beyond Sir Roderick's immediate circle. One by one, the conspirators would be dealt with, some through legal proceedings, others through more direct methods. Lord Pemberton was executed publicly for treason, his lands and wealth distributed to the families of his victims. The corrupt magistrates who had processed forged documents found themselves facing the very penalties they had imposed on innocent people. Several minor nobles discovered that their own complicity in the slave trade had consequences that extended far beyond their expectations. But the most satisfying justice came 3 weeks after the siege ended, when the king's agents began returning with freed slaves. The plantations and mines that had purchased people with forged documents were raided simultaneously across multiple provinces. Families were reunited, children returned to their parents, and the machinery of human trafficking was dismantled piece by piece. Not everyone could be saved. Some had died in captivity. Others had been sold too far away to trace quickly. But dozens of people who had vanished into slavery walked free again, their freedom purchased with Sir Roderick's blood. Mira watched one such reunion from the castle's walls, tears streaming down her face as a mother embraced children she had thought lost forever. The guilt and relief were almost too intense to witness, but she forced herself to watch anyway. This was what justice looked like. Not just punishment for the guilty, but restoration for the innocent. Second thoughts, the king asked, joining her at the battlements. About killing Roderick? No, Mira wiped her eyes. About whether it was worth the cost? Sometimes. War always has a cost. The question is whether the alternative would have been worse. And what do you think? I think Sir Roderick would have continued destroying lives for as long as he drew breath. I think the Northern Alliance would have found other ways to destabilize the kingdom. And I think your children are safer now than they would have been with him alive. Speaking of her children, Finn and Sarah had adapted to castle life with the resilience of youth. Finn had appointed himself assistant to the castle's armorer, fascinated by the process of making and repairing weapons. Sarah had been adopted by the kitchen staff, who spoiled her shamelessly and taught her to bake bread that rivaled the head cook's own efforts. They were happy, healthy, and safe. Everything Mira had dreamed of during those dark months of poverty and fear. What happens now, she asked the king, with the conspiracy exposed and the immediate threat ended? Now we rebuild. We create systems that make future conspiracies harder to organize and easier to detect. We establish protections for skilled craftsmen and their families. We ensure that no one else suffers what you suffered. And personally, the king was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes thoughtful. Personally, I've been thinking about the nature of trust, how quickly it can be betrayed, how slowly it can be rebuilt. You're talking about your counsel, about trusting advisors again. Among other things, he turned to look at her directly. I've been thinking about offering you a position in the new intelligence network we're building. Someone with your insights, your determination. You could help prevent future tragedies. Mira considered this. The idea of working in espionage, of dealing with the same shadows and secrets that had destroyed her family, held little appeal. But the opportunity to protect other families from similar fates. What kind of position? Coordinator of civilian protection. Your job would be to identify vulnerable craftsmen, merchants, and their families. People with valuable knowledge or skills who might be targeted by foreign agents or criminal networks. You'd work to establish safe houses, secure communications, and early warning systems. A spy master for the innocent. Something like that. You'd have resources, authority, and most importantly, the trust of people who might not cooperate with traditional agents. The king's expression was serious. You understand what it's like to be powerless, to be dismissed as unimportant. That perspective would be invaluable. It was tempting, but Mira had other priorities. My children need stability. They've been through enough upheaval. They could grow up here in the castle, the best tutors, proper training, opportunities they'd never have elsewhere. The king paused. And you could ensure that no other children face what they faced. That argument was harder to resist. Mira looked out over the valley where the northern forces had camped, imagining other armies, other threats, other families caught in the crossfire of political ambition. I'll need time to think about it. Of course, the offer will remain open. A week later, Mira gave him her answer. She would accept the position, but with conditions. Her children's safety and education were paramount. She would work from the castle, but travel as needed, and she would have final authority over protection decisions. No political considerations would override the safety of innocent people. The king agreed to all her terms without hesitation. The new intelligence network that emerged from the ashes of Sir Roderick's betrayal was fundamentally different from its predecessor. Where the old system had relied on shadows and secrets, the new one emphasized transparency and accountability. Where the old system had treated people as expendable assets, the new one made protecting innocence its highest priority. Mira threw herself into the work with fierce dedication. She established networks of craftsmen who watched out for each other, created safe houses for people who felt threatened, and developed early warning systems that could detect the first signs of conspiracy or foreign interference. The work was satisfying in ways she hadn't expected. Every family she helped protect, every craftsman she warned of danger, every child she kept safe from the slave trade felt like a small victory over the forces that had destroyed her own life. Henrik, now officially appointed as master craftsman to the crown, helped coordinate with blacksmiths, woodworkers, and other skilled artisans throughout the kingdom. His network of professional contacts proved invaluable in detecting unusual commissions or suspicious requests. Thomas would be proud, he told Mira one evening, as they reviewed reports in the solar that had become her office. You've turned his death into something that protects others. I hope so, Mira replied, studying a map marked with the locations of protected families. Sometimes I wonder if we're doing enough. You can't save everyone, Henrik reminded her gently, but you can save some, and that's more than most people manage. The children thrived in their new life. Finn, now 10, had grown tall and strong under the castle's training regimen. He spent his mornings with tutors learning letters and numbers, his afternoons with the armorer learning metalwork, and his evenings practicing swordplay with the younger guards. Sarah, 8 and precocious, had appointed herself unofficial ambassador to visiting dignitaries. Her natural charm and innocent questions often revealed more about visitors' true intentions than formal interrogation might have accomplished. Both children remembered their father with love and their ordeal with surprising resilience. They understood that their mother's work was important, dangerous, and necessary. They were proud of what she had accomplished and fiercely protective of the family they had rebuilt from tragedy. "Do you ever regret it?" Finn asked one evening as they walked through the castle's gardens. "Killing that man, starting this new life?" It was a mature question from a boy who had grown up too fast. Mira considered her answer carefully. "I regret that it was necessary," she said finally. "I regret that people like Sir Roderick exist, that families like ours get caught in political conspiracies, that children have to grow up afraid." She paused beside a fountain where Sarah was playing with wooden boats. "But I don't regret stopping him. I don't regret protecting you and your sister. And I don't regret building something better from the pieces of what was destroyed." "Good," Finn said with satisfaction. "Because I'm proud of you, Mama, for being strong enough to fight back." That night, as Mira tucked her children into their beds in chambers far grander than anything she had ever dreamed of, she reflected on how much had changed since that terrible day at the auction block. She was no longer the broken Omega who had stood in chains while nobles mocked her appearance. She was a woman of authority and influence, respected by peers who valued her judgment and feared by enemies who understood her determination. Her children were no longer frightened waifs cowering in the shadows. They were confident, educated, and secure in the knowledge that they were loved and protected. The kingdom was no longer vulnerable to the kind of corruption that had allowed Sir Roderick to operate with impunity. The new systems she had helped create would make future conspiracies far more difficult to organize and sustain. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was. There were still threats, still people who needed protection, still injustices that required correction. But it was better, measurably, significantly better. As she prepared for bed in her own chambers, Mira caught sight of herself in the polished steel mirror. The face looking back was older, marked by stress and responsibility, but also strengthened by purpose and achievement. She was still a large woman, still bore the soft curves that had made her a target for mockery. But now those curves were clothed in fine fabrics and adorned with the symbols of her office. Now they represented not weakness or shame, but the resilience of someone who had survived the worst and built something meaningful from the wreckage. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. King Aldrich entered, carrying 2 cups of mulled wine and wearing the expression he reserved for their private conversations. "How was your day?" he asked, settling into a chair by the fire. It had become a ritual of theirs, these evening discussions where the king and his intelligence coordinator reviewed the day's work and planned for tomorrow's challenges. But over the months, the conversations had evolved beyond mere professional necessity. "Productive. We identified 3 more craftsmen who might be at risk, and Henrik's network reported suspicious activities near the eastern border." Mira accepted the wine gratefully. "How was the council meeting?" "Tedious but necessary. The lords are still adjusting to having their intelligence operations supervised by civilian oversight committees." The king's smile was wry. "They're not entirely pleased with the new accountability requirements." "Good. They should be uncomfortable. Comfort breeds complacency, and complacency leads to corruption." Spoken like a true spy master. Spoken like someone who's seen what happens when power operates without oversight. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire dance in the hearth. It was peaceful, a hard-won tranquility that both of them treasured after the chaos of the past year. "Mira," the king said finally, his voice unusually hesitant. "Yes?" "I've been thinking about the future, about succession, about the stability of the kingdom, about personal matters." Something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. "What kind of personal matters?" "The kind that involve asking whether you might consider a change in your official status." Mira's heart stopped. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," the king said quietly, "that a king needs a queen, someone he trusts absolutely, someone who shares his vision for the kingdom's future, someone who has proven her worth in both crisis and peace." The wine cup trembled in her hands. "Aldrich, I'm not asking for an answer tonight. I know this is sudden, unexpected. But I wanted you to know that my feelings toward you have evolved beyond professional respect or gratitude for your service." "Into what?" "Into love," he said simply. "Deep, abiding, and entirely inappropriate for a king to feel toward his intelligence coordinator." Mira set down her wine with hands that weren't quite steady. This is madness. I'm a blacksmith's widow, a former slave, a woman who was auctioned like livestock. You're the most remarkable person I've ever known, the king interrupted. You're brave, intelligent, compassionate, and strong enough to kill a man with your bare hands when your children were threatened. Any king would be fortunate to have such a woman as his queen. The nobles will never accept it. A commoner and Omega, someone with my history. The nobles will accept what I tell them to accept. And if they don't, we'll find new nobles. His pale eyes were serious. Mira, I'm not offering you a political marriage or a convenient arrangement. I'm offering you my heart, my crown, and my commitment to building something worthy of the sacrifices we both made. The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility and fear. Mira's mind raced through implications, obstacles, opportunities. The children would be legitimate heirs to the throne. She would have the power to protect not just vulnerable craftsmen, but entire populations. The new intelligence network would have the crown's full support. But more than that, and she was almost afraid to admit it to herself, the idea of a partnership with this man, this king who had risked everything to save her family and then trusted her with the kingdom's security, held a deep and powerful appeal. The children, she said finally, would be raised as my own. Finn would be trained for leadership, Sarah for whatever role she chooses for herself. They would want for nothing. And if I say yes, what happens to the woman who was mocked and humiliated at an auction block? She becomes the queen who reformed the kingdom's intelligence services and protected countless innocent families from the fate she herself suffered. The king's voice was soft but certain. She becomes a legend, Mira, the Omega who rose from slavery to wear the crown. It was a beautiful vision, but Mira had learned to be suspicious of beautiful visions. And if I say no, then you remain my most trusted advisor and valued friend. Nothing changes professionally. This conversation never happened if you prefer it that way. She believed him. That was the remarkable thing. After everything she had endured, she trusted this man completely. I need time to think, she said. Of course, take all the time you need. But even as she said it, Mira realized she had already made her decision. The moment he had used the word love, the moment she had seen the vulnerability in those pale eyes, she had known what her answer would be. She had spent too much of her life being afraid, being careful, accepting less than she deserved because she thought she wasn't worthy of more. The auction block had taught her that safety was an illusion, that dignity could only be maintained through courage, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought by people who had everything to lose. Actually, she said, setting down her wine cup and meeting his gaze directly, I don't think I need more time. The king went very still. No, my answer is yes. The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise after the longest night. He set down his own cup and moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. Are you certain? Once this becomes public knowledge, every young woman in the kingdom will know that birth doesn't determine worth, that circumstances don't define possibilities, and that love can triumph over the worst kinds of prejudice. Mira's voice was steady, confident. I can't think of a better message to send. The king raised her hands to his lips, pressing gentle kisses to her knuckles. Then we should probably discuss the practical details. The ceremony, the announcement, the political implications. Later, Mira said firmly, tonight, I just want to be a woman who said yes to the man she loves. And I just want to see the man fortunate enough to hear that answer. They sat together by the fire, planning a future that neither of them could have imagined a year before. Outside the windows, the kingdom slept peacefully under the protection of walls that had never fallen and guards who had never faltered. In the distance, church bells began to ring the midnight hour, their bronze voices carrying across sleeping villages where families slept safely in their beds, protected by networks of watchful neighbors and early warning systems that would never again allow innocent people to vanish without trace. The Omega who had once stood in chains on an auction block was going to be queen. The children who had once cowered in fear were going to be princes. The kingdom that had once been vulnerable to corruption and foreign interference was going to be stronger, more just, and more vigilant than ever before. It was not the ending anyone could have predicted when the torches first flickered in Merchant Square and the auctioneer's voice had cut through Mira's dignity like a blade. But it was the ending they had all earned through courage, sacrifice, and an absolute refusal to accept that might made right. Justice had indeed been paid for in blood. But in the end, it had also been rewarded with love, hope, and the unshakable certainty that sometimes the most powerful force in the world was a mother's determination to protect her children and build a better world from the ashes of the old. The last part was over. The new beginning had just begun, and in the castle where a king had once paid 50 gold marks for a woman and her children at auction, wedding bells would soon ring out in celebration of a love that had conquered every obstacle placed in its path. Some fairy tales, Mira thought as she fell asleep in the arms of her future husband, were worth fighting for.